So first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for the invitation. I wanted to thank Klaas and Yolanda and AHJ for hosting the screening. Very few places where the kind of Mexican story is told in the US, in my opinion. So just very grateful for the opportunity to screen here. So thank you again. And I was, just be interested in having an informal discussion with you all too. So just wanted to open it up to questions. And happy to talk about any aspect of the process. So.
Did you feel that you were in any kind of danger while you were doing this?
So the question is about danger, whether or not I felt I was in danger. I think there are two ways that a film like this can be dangerous. One is to be filming active, right, in an active combat situation, or to be filming, a conflict as it's unfolding. The second way is, of course, to point fingers, or to sometimes just the very selection of the material itself can be problematic. I thankfully I and my crew were never in direct danger. Adela Navarro, the co-director of the newspaper, she did receive threats while we were filming, not because of her participation in the film, but just because of ongoing reporting that was looking at the nexus between political corruption and the narcos. But one always has concerns about how a film will be received. This film did screen in Mexico. We did a 12-city tour in Mexico through this the itinerant documentary festival Ambulante, which was started by the actors Diego Luna and Gael Garcia Bernal. And so we did kind of extensive screenings in Mexico. It just actually recently screened for the Senate in Mexico. Around the issue of attacks on the press. So it's had a strong life in Mexico. But thankfully, I and my crew always had the advantage of leaving and not being in any kind of direct danger.
How long did you work on this?
So the question is how long we worked on the film. I was in active production for roughly, from start to finish, about 2 years. But previous to that, had been researching that kind of story. I actually backed into this story. I had no intention of making a film about a journalist or this newspaper in Mexico. I was actually researching a story about the shelter for deported minors. There's a very brief sequence at the kind of first third of the film where Sergio Ardo is taking photographs of the recently kind of repatriated children. And I wanted to make a kind of quiet, short film just about that shelter. And I managed to raise a little bit of money just to get myself into trouble, really, to go to the shelter. And so I arrived in Mexicali, and it coincided with a kind of rise in narco violence. So it was about 2008 when I arrived. And when I was there, every single person that I talked to was talking about a relative who'd been kidnapped, or a business that had been shuttered because of extortion, being unable to pay extortion payments. And so I thought, I really need to talk to somebody who has perspective on this issue. And so I asked actually the director of the shelter, said, can you introduce me to a local journalist who might be able to help me? And I actually met Sergio Ardo at a Starbucks on the Mexican side of the border. And I always tell the story, and it really bugs him, but it's true. I met him at a Starbucks, and it was like a good first date. Within 3 minutes, I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that this person hasn't shared his story. And he was right at a moment in his career where he wanted to reflect on, was nearly 3 decades of reporting, kind of laboring invisibly, not getting any kind of recognition for his work. And it began a kind of a whole process. But I knew at that point, Sergio's story and the story of the paper, that I knew that it would be much more urgent than the original proposition, which was to do something on the shelter. Good question back there. So Zeta, I would say the question is whether Semanario Zeta is unique. And I would say that they're both unique and not unique. They're unique in the sense that the smaller regional newspapers are infinitely more vulnerable to pressures, to attacks than the national papers. So obviously the big Mexico City dailies have a very different kind of security outlook. The smaller regional papers are much more vulnerable. There are very famous cases in the last few years. Famously, El Mañana, which is a daily out of Nuevo Laredo, just south of Laredo. They've had grenade attacks. They actually wrote an open editorial saying, you who are the de facto authorities, aka the narco bosses, tell us what you want us to write. We're tired of losing our journalists. We're tired of receiving threats. Just tell us what you want us to write. So there are other papers in these kind of smaller regions. The state of Veracruz has seen some really horrific attacks against the press. Zeta is unique in the sense that they kind of leverage their position on the border, their proximity to the United States, as a kind of, they used it skillfully as a way to kind of gain advantage. And they continue to be, very independent, very, very aggressive. They're not to everybody's liking. The coverage can sometimes be a little sensationalistic, but I would say that they're unique in the sense that they kind of predated what's happening now. There are certainly other papers in Mexico that have taken a cue from Zeta. Another good example is Rio 12 in the state of Sinaloa, which is a kind of hotbed of narco activity. They kind of picked up a lot of skills and kind of modeled themselves after Zeta in some ways.
Is there any public outcry about these murders? People protests?
Yeah. So the question is about public outcry for the murders. Unfortunately, the case of Seminario Zeta is not a unique case in Mexico. There have been some very famous and some very high-profile attacks against the press in Mexico. But really, you have to look at what's happening to the press in Mexico within the larger context. I and many others would argue there's a very serious human rights crisis in Mexico. I'm sure everyone here heard that in the fall and September of last year, 43 students in the state of Guerrero were abducted and are missing, which has galvanized civil society. There is a massive protest movement going on. Some of the families of those 43 students are caravanning through the United States. We actually just saw them in Texas. So there's a kind of broader human rights context within which we have to look at what's happening to the press. But there is a response from civil society. I think the question remains, what kind of support they have from the international community. Question over there. Good.
Where Sergio was saying that walking away is kind of like being an accomplice. How do you feel the relationship between journalists and what's going on in the broader society should be or can be?
Well, I guess you were asking the question about what the relationship is, if I understood it correctly, between kind of the role of the journalist and the kind of broader society. I can share one thing that Sergio would tell me when I was filming him, and one of the things that he would share with me is that he doesn't consider himself an activist at all. He feels like his job is to just get information out there. And then it is the job of the judiciary, of civil society, to do something with that information. As you see in the piece where they published that interrogation video where, high-level members, when a cell of an organized crime group is, they admit to working with the Attorney General's office in the state of Baja, that information was made public and nothing happened, right? So what Sergio would say is that it's not my responsibility to change society, but it is my responsibility to get that information out there. One other thing that he'd say to me frequently, he'd kind of chide me as a Mexican American. I mean, I'm a dual citizen of the U.S. and Mexico, but one thing he'd say to me is, "Where's the U.S. reporting on the narcotics market?" In other words, who's doing the reporting on where the narco dollars are being banked? I've said this many times, but one of the things that he'd kind of nudge us about is, when vehicles with illicit narcotics enter the United States, it's not as if they magically vanish. Who's doing the reporting on the criminal distribution networks within the United States, on consumption and all of these other pieces? He said, I can't do that because I live in Mexico. So my job is to report on what's happening locally. And so that's what he sees as his responsibility. Question over here?
I have a question about them printing in the United States and bringing it over. Like, is there protection? And the truck has Zeta on the side and it's being driven in. What's to stop them from getting the truck? And if they're doing that, then have there been any attacks on the trucks as far as distribution is concerned?
So question is about attacks on the Zeta, distributors as they're delivering the papers in Mexico. In the kind of first 2 decades, the trucks were unmarked. That's my understanding, is they were unmarked for most of the time. By now, Zeta is a pretty well-oiled machine. It's a pretty established institution, and there isn't necessarily that same immediate sense of danger with regards to the publication. Obviously, much of reporting has also shifted to the kind of digital realm. And at the time that I was filming Seminario Zeta, they were struggling with that transition from kind of print to kind of social media. There have been a number of very public cases of citizen journalists and others in northern Mexico who've been covering organized crime activities, either being threatened or being murdered. So in some ways, you can argue that the locus of a lot of attention has shifted into that social media space. There's a kind of older and very loyal readership to Seminario Zeta, which relies on that print paper, but it's not. I don't think it's at the center of so much of where the danger is as it used to be. That can always change, obviously, but. Okay.
Violence in Tijuana has gone up and down over the years, in part whether the cartels are fighting for the plaza or not. I just wondered, is it generally safer when, one cartel is running as opposed to they're having a big battle, and what's the situation now?
So I just finished another film where I spent a lot of time with a Homeland Security investigator who was a former undercover. So first new thing for me to spend so much time with a law enforcement person. And one of the things that he would always say is that, look, there was a greater sense of safety when it was one organized crime group managing things. Much of the violence, according to this Homeland Security investigator, stems from the fact that you have these smaller splinter groups fighting over territory, over distribution routes into the United States. So that's really that kind of where it becomes very violent. I would also when I screen this film in Mexico, I sometimes get a hard time, in particular from wealthier residents of Tijuana, who are very sensitive to the image of their city as this kind of lawless place. Like all places, Tijuana has, it's got high-end malls, it's got great restaurants, there's a burgeoning wine industry in the Guadalupe Valley. There's many things going on. This is just one piece of that story, but and in the time that I was filming, it was just as the kind of violence was tapering off in 2010. Yet there are still army barricades, Mexican military, the region of a particular part of the Mexican military was still camped there because of threats. And very recently, one of the Arellano Felix brothers was just arrested actually for watching a World Cup game. He went out to a public place and was busted. So the organized crime presence continues to be very serious. Tijuana will continue to be a transshipment route as long as U.S. consumption demands that narcotics and people flow through there. So it ebbs and flows. But there are many realities, just as there are in the Bay, right? You have very wealthy places and you have very poor places. Any question over there?
You're talking in the film about Hector Gato Felix and his murder in 1988, and then you mentioned Jorge Hunt, I think is how you pronounce his name, who was elected mayor of Tijuana, and then governor of Baja California. Well, in the state of Nuevo León, there was a case in Monterrey about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, where there was a casino and they firebombed the exits from the casino, forcing people not to be able to get out of the casino. And then somebody went in there with a mitrailladora and shot up a bunch of people. And about 5 or 6 blocks down the street, there was several of these police cars, jeeps with machine guns mounted on the back of them. And they were all sitting there. They didn't move when the attack occurred. In fact, they didn't move for about 10 or 15 minutes until after the attack was over. So the people that did the thing escaped. Then later on, 2 newspapers. One was called El Norte, and the other was Reforma in Ciudad de Mexico. El Norte, I think, was in Monterrey, Nuevo León. And these 2 newspapers are connected, I think. And when they publish their articles on subjects like this, they don't put down the name of the person who's a journalist, the byline. They just put down the staff of the newspaper, so that you can't actually accuse a certain journalist and then go out and assassinate him. Well, anyway, in this case, they actually went over some of the video cameras in the various casinos. They found that the brother of the governor of the state of Nuevo León had been visiting various casinos, and he had actually been apparently accepting payments.
Right.
And they actually had photographs from these big cameras at the top of the casino showing him actually accepting the little sacks of money for payments and so on and so forth. And then the governor of Nuevo León, I think, was the Calderon party, PAN. And so there was a big scandal about whether the governor should resign or shouldn't. Anyway, the point was the two newspapers were in the focus because we were reporting on this. On the other hand, they had this policy of not putting down anyone's name on the front page of the newspaper, so you couldn't really tell who was responsible, and so they just staffed.
Yep.
And then they continued, I think eventually something happened. I'm not sure exactly what happened on that case.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're deeply informed about that Monterrey story, which is a really horrific story. Over 50 people were either died of smoke inhalation or were burned alive. And the crime of setting fire to that casino, the Casino Royale in Monterrey that you mentioned, was attributed to the Zetas, which, the former enforcers of the Gulf Cartel. And there's also, there are FBI documents linking the Zetas to, some of them were trained in the United States at the School of the Americas, and there's broad consensus about that. There's nothing kind of controversial about that anymore. But the point that you mentioned, that Monterrey and where Sergio operates are kind of two interesting examples, because Monterrey is a much larger city. It's a very wealthy city, probably the wealthiest in Mexico, if not one of the wealthiest in Latin America. Whereas Mexicali, where the state capital of Baja, where Sergio is operating, even if he were to use a collective byline and report on organized crime, but for him to say, or for the paper to say, just a Zeta report, it would be so easy for anyone with any kind of intelligence to identify who the reporter was. It would be essentially meaningless to have a kind of collective byline in Mexicali. Very thin veneer of protection. Whereas in a place like Monterrey, a little harder to kind of determine who that person was. But
the articles were published simultaneously in Ciudad de Mexico by Reforma, and then Monterrey by El Norte.
Yeah. Local, local reporters, again, face a much greater threat. And I mean, the kind of lower your profile, the more vulnerable you are, which is what we've seen in other states in Mexico, like Veracruz, where Moises Sanchez was killed for his local reporting.
So why don't they legalize drugs?
Good question. Unfortunately, I think in the case, one of the things that we see in Mexico.
Instead of pirates.
No, I think there's a good argument to be had there. In the case of Mexico, there's also a judicial system. There's a high degree of corruption. I think there are other things. There are other things at play there, but.
Sure, but they could become the leading capitalists of Mexico.
I think some people would argue that the cartels are kind of like the kind of perfect capitalists in a way. It's a kind of hyper capitalism. But question over here.
Slightly different note. I was just wondering if newspapers in Mexico are feeling the same economic pressures that ones in the United States are, as far as consolidations, buyouts, watering down editorial lines, all that type of thing. If that's happening in Mexico, or is it quite different as far as how the economics work for the papers?
One thing that was interesting while I was filming, the Zeta during that 2-year period, it's a paper that's actually profitable, and it's profitable because of both advertising and a very loyal subscription base. I mean, that has changed, but in the part of, there's a relatively low internet penetration rate in Baja. The number, I don't know what the numbers are now, but the high literacy rate actually in the north of Mexico. So at the time that I was filming, print still mattered. It's still a very kind of relevant way to gain information. In fact, the car armoring plant that you see in the film, they actually advertise in Semanario Zeta in the pages of the newspaper there. The kind of, that older model is still valid in some places. Just like everywhere else in the world, obviously everything has migrated, online, and you now have, there's Vice Mexico, and there are, hundreds and dozens, if not hundreds, of news outlets that are operating digitally in Mexico. So yes, the same pressures certainly apply. Probably slightly different expressions of the same problem that you're having there, with the added kind of pressure of censorship, self-censorship, I don't know if there are people who are kind of Mexico watchers in general, but very recently, earlier in the month, one of Mexico's most prominent broadcast journalists, Carmen Aristegui, a very critical journalist, was fired from her position from MVS Radio. So very, very, very prominent journalist. And she and her team had been doing some critical reporting on the current president and some of his dealings with his homes and a former contractor. And she was abruptly fired in a story that has caused a lot of controversy in Mexico. So a very kind of public firing of a very prominent broadcast journalist.
With all the power that the cartels have, I'm surprised that they are just picking on individuals instead of just blowing up the whole station, the whole office or something. So has that happened before, or is it just continuing to kill reporters?
Yeah, the question is about attacking individuals versus attacking whole places. It depends on the region, and there have been some very high-profile cases of news outlets being attacked. In 2008 in Monterrey, actually the U.S. consulate was attacked. It was attributed to the Zetas. There was a grenade attack on a U.S. consulate. But in general, it tends to be, there does seem to be a kind of pattern. At least this is what the journalists at Zeta would pass along to me. It's those stories where people who are used to operating with impunity or anonymity, when you name names. So when you're looking at that nexus, that unholy nexus between organized crime and politics, when you're looking at that space in between those two things, the kind of reporting on that is what has generated the biggest violence, the biggest attacks. And it's easier to attack an individual than it is a large institution. Individuals are vulnerable in different ways. They have families. They can be caught alone. They can be caught unawares. Yeah. So, Chris.
The story you mentioned on Carmen
Aristegui, yeah.
It was in the New York Times on Sunday.
Yeah.
And do you think, where do you think she'll go? Is there another place for her in journalism?
I definitely, Aristegui has been a very critical. I think she's widely respected. There are some people that think that have criticized her for being too much of a kind of conspiracy theorist. I personally think she's a very responsible journalist. She undoubtedly will have a kind of second or third act in Mexican public life. The MVS who fired her might have to take her back again. We don't know. Regardless, she's such a public figure. And what's happened is that she has been closely aligned now with this, with a kind of burgeoning protest movement. We were talking about the 43 students who disappeared and the kind of the massive wave of criticism that's been generated against the current administration from civil society. So there are kind of series of things that are happening right now where I think another event could really kind of change the direction of where Mexico is headed. So certainly from a PR standpoint, if I were the PR company managing the current administration's public image, I would be very concerned right now. A massive and very public human rights crisis that's being made known internationally, and the firing of one of the country's most prominent journalists, that it raises some very serious questions.
One other question on the newspaper Zeta. What was the circulation?
I don't remember the circulation offhand right now. At its height, I think it was about 30,000. But it is now, it's on Facebook, they're on Twitter. They're not as nimble as some of the other kind of publications. Rio 12 has a kind of stronger online presence. There are other papers in Latin America and Central America that have, a much kind of more nimble presence online. I think a great example is there's a publication called El Faro out of El Salvador, which is a wholly online, very strong investigative journalism, kind of an extraordinary paper. They just went right online, they bypassed the printing process. Great.
We might have time for just
one more.
Is the paper also sold in Mexicali, or is it just in Tijuana? Is it Mexicali too?
Yeah, so Zeta is sold all throughout the state of Baja, so including Mexicali and Ensenada and Tijuana, so all over the state. There are even a few places outside of the Baja region where it's sold. Some people in San Diego and California read it there too. And Adela Navarro also is frequently on shows in Mexico City. So she also talks to the kind of national security situation as well, even though they're in Baja. Great. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.